Okay, well, I'd like to welcome everybody to our last meeting of June for the IMAG MSM Working Group on Multiscale Modeling of Viral Pandemics. I need to remind you that the meeting will be recorded and is being live streamed on YouTube, and that those recordings will be available after the meeting. Appreciate all of you joining us today. We have two great speakers and looking forward to it. As always, people have seen this slide many times. Reinhard and myself as leads of the working group, Jim Sluka and Bruce Shapiro helping us in all sorts of useful ways. Please feel free to contact us if there are any issues that you want to address. As always, also, we have a variety of communication media which don't work unless people use them. So please do consider using our Slack channel, our Twitter channel, updating our IMAG MSM wiki page, our LinkedIn page. We do have a nice archive of talks on YouTube. Please try to make sure that people know about them. I think they're excellent resource and could use more attention. I had the announcement that I made before. Last week we had a little issue where somebody, I think, accidentally turned on Annotate and then started scribbling doodles on the screen. So please try not to turn on your Annotate button on your Zoom session and accidentally. If there's an appropriate annotation, that's fine. I like to allow that to be available, but please be careful about that. And please, of course, mute your microphones when you're not speaking. I'd like to ask if there are any announcements for the working group. Does anybody have any short announcements that they would like to make today? No, nobody has any announcements today.
James, we should probably alert people to next week's meeting.
I will. Just to,
okay.
Okay, tomorrow we have a steering committee meeting. For those of you who need to be there, Reinhardt will be leading the steering committee meeting as usual at 11 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time. If you're supposed to be there, we look forward to seeing you. If you think you should be there and you didn't get an invitation, let us know and we'll see what went wrong.
James, excuse me, I'm Filippo here.
Yes, please.
I wanted just to make this announcement. Now, I sent an email to Bruce, so he will probably, he already posted this call for papers, but I am co-editing with the other two colleagues, Frontiers special issue on multi-scale hybrid models of the immune system. I just wanted to tell you, if you're interested, please let me know if you want to contribute. So the link is around on the, what is it? He will circulate in one of the email from Bruce, I guess. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much for the announcement. Are there any other announcements? People are joining now, so I don't want to cut people off. Thank you very much for the announcement. No. Okay, I want to remind you that next week things will be a little bit different. We're going to have a special longer session. It's going to run from 3 to 5. It is going to be on the new NIH initiative on Bridge to AI in the first half, and on digital twins more generally in the second half. Grace Peng and Reid Shabman will be presenting, and potentially other program directors from NIH and elsewhere. That meeting will be open to all of the IMAG community, not, of course, this is an open meeting, so anybody can join this meeting, but there are going to be invitations sent out to all of the IMAG community, not just to our working group, and at least for the first half. As you know, NIH has 2 RFAs out now, one for U54 bridge centers and one for data collection efforts. in the area of artificial intelligence. They just finished 2 weeks of intermittent sessions related to thinking about AI projects and grand challenges. I know many of you have participated in those. I went through them. One of the things that I suggested was that a useful grand challenge would be a digital twin of the immune system. And there was a lot of enthusiasm for that idea. And so if anybody feels that they could do the data collection, because they're currently in the data collection phase, if somebody wanted to lead a clinical trial, a data collection on data to enable an artificial intelligence-based digital twin of the immune system, please talk to me, because I think there'd be a lot of enthusiasm for it. And I'm certainly not the person to lead that effort. Reinhardt also has been involved in that. And if you want to talk to us, we'd be happy to do that. July 8th, we have Evan Patterson and James Fairbanks. July 15th, we have our two distinguished journalists who will be joining us, Martha Mendoza and Alasu Bayak. They originally were scheduled for July 1st and graciously agreed to delay their talks by 2 weeks to allow Grace and Reed to speak. And we'll be posting more information about the meeting next week. Grace has asked us to ask you to try to scare up the biggest crowd possible because they are trying to get across the message of Bridge to AI to the broadest possible community. And they also want to emphasize, perhaps given our speakers today, it's particularly important that those Bridge to AI grants and centers can be anywhere. Usually NIH centers are restricted to the US, not always, but usually. NIH grants in general can go anywhere in the world, but centers usually have to be in the US. In this case, the centers can be anywhere. Participants in the grants can be anywhere, and the lead centers can be international as well. And so I'm certainly not an expert on it, but if you're interested in these possibilities, please do show up next week and ask Grace about the details. So I guess we will have plenty of time for discussion. So we will, as usual, reserve questions until after the two talks, and then we'll begin discussion. And I will give a 5-minute warning if it looks like people maybe overrun their time. But we have essentially 45 minutes to get through the two talks. And so I ask our speakers to try to be on time. So we'll begin our seminars with a presentation by Liesbet Geris, who's going to be talking about the very successful and long-term Virtual Physiological Human Institute, which has existed now in many years in various incarnations. And I, as you know, don't typically do elaborate introductions, so I will turn it over to her immediately.
Okay, thank you very much for the invitation, James and John and Reinhardt. It's really a pleasure to be able to talk to you today, and I'll just put this on full screen first before I go any further. So there you go. This should be fine, right? Can you see the full screen?
Yes, looks good.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so in my daily life, I'm a professor at the University of Liège and the KU Leuven, and my group works on computational tissue engineering applications. So the crossover between skeletal tissue engineering and in silico medicine. But I'll be talking to you today out of my role as executive director of the VPH Institute, which is the International Society for in silico medicine. It started as a collection of calls within a European framework program way before my time. And those people who in those grants came together and founded now 10 years ago, the VPH Institute. So this is not an institute, it's a virtual, it's a non-profit organization that is actually a scientific society. So what I will not be talking about today is why to do in silico medicine, because you all know that, and why to add in silico as a standard biomedical tool to the toolbox. There are many excellent speeches every week here in this platform. I will also not talk about what all the different things are that can be done. And for a full overview, there's here a reference to a paper that the community just published, giving a full overview of all the different contexts of uses that you could have for in silico medicine, inspired or ended on the 3 R's theme. So this is all what I will not cover, but what I would like to talk to you about today is the role of the community. How do we bring our in silico applications from the screen to the patient? And what is the role of academic researchers in such an in silico community? So I will do that by explaining some of the activities that we as the VPH Institute are doing, and also in what we are doing in collaboration with industry in another nonprofit called the Avicenna Alliance, where you have a 50-50 academia industry composition. So I'd like to, by means of a number of activities that we are driving together, I would like to show you how as a community, we can actually make a difference, and a difference that will then help us and each individual PI that is working on in silico medicine solutions, how it will help those people bring their solution closer to the patient. So there's 5 examples that I will be talking about today. As I said, the community is at the heart of my presentation, and it is also the middle ground between having a technical implementation, so your one solution that you're working on with the specific expertise that you have, and being able to drive this all the way to policy, to implementation in regulation, which you collaborate with peers, which you need a community to drive all the different elements of that transition from the screen to the patient. So really, this is the middle between the technical and the policy. And what we as VPHi and the Avicenna Alliance want to be is we want to be the go-to organizations for all issues related to in silico medicine, not just in Europe where we started, but in the US. We have a large representation in the US as well, and basically anywhere else in the world where in silico medicine is being practiced. And the goal is to establish this entire path from the computer screen to the patient. Now, as VPHi, so part of our job is to organize the science, is to organize our conferences, our webinars, our summer schools, to do a lot of communication and dissemination. If you are not registered yet for our newsletter, I highly recommend it because it contains some useful information about some policy initiatives in the in silico domain. But then together with the Avicenna Alliance, we go a bit further than your average scientific society, and we really try to engage with policymakers, with the funders, with standard organizations, trying to share knowledge and improve the quality, and actively engage with all kinds of different stakeholders, from the medical community to the HTAs, to the patients, to get them all involved and behind the concept of in silico medicine. So what I already mentioned, what this will cover is the importance of the community, the role that academics can have, and then the different activities. Let me start with one that is the interaction with regulatory agencies. And there in the US, you have the advantage because FDA is super proactive in that sense, especially for medical devices, where they spearheaded the regulations, the VMV 40. So this is something that we really were looking at a little bit envious in Europe, because we have this dual structure where we have a regulator for the devices and we have regulators for the drugs. And then we have in each member state a regulator, then we have a joint European one. So it's a bit more messy. And also these organizations are not, they don't have the large cohort of researchers in-house that FDA has. But nevertheless, we need to work with them in order to try and push the in silico agenda as far as possible. So this is the context. So the ASME provided us a good reason to push harder with them to engage in talks about in silico medicine. And there were a number of other initiatives. There is the international, the ICH, who is working on a reflection on model and model-inspired drug development. There is the EMA, so that's our European Medicine Agency, that is working with the joint health medicine agencies on a strategy. So there were a number of things that we could use to really grab hold of our regulators and try to work out guidelines for the evaluation of in silico medicine. And one good thing about being involved also in the policy part is that sometimes when a direct interaction doesn't really work, there can be an indirect route. And in this case, through lobbying with the European Commission, we were able to get little bits of text in some of the important regulations mentioning digital technologies, computer models, simulations. And as soon as one of these words is in such a regulation, that is something, you know, then there is an official document that we can refer to and that people have to respond to. So all these things together helped us. And what is it that we then did with the regulators? We engaged in a three-way conversation with industry, academia, and them to try and get them to agree to a set of guidelines on how to assess the credibility of in silico models. And of course, there was already the VMV, which was not for drugs, but which was very generic in its content, so could be applied to drugs. And then what we had to do was to somehow translate this to the language that was used in the European Medicine Agency, where they have some subtle differences, but at least we could try and make sure that the philosophy of the whole thing was the same. And if you look at this flow chart here, you will recognize a lot of things from the VMV 40, like starting with the definition of the question of interest, the context of use, then identifying acceptability criteria, detailing the data collection for that. And then we came to something that is slightly different, whereas with FDA, you work on model risk assessment with two axes, where you have one, what is the impact of the model on the decision, and then what is the impact of the model on the consequence, so the consequence when it goes wrong, so that model risk. For the EMA, what we have to add there in that risk part is also the regulatory impact assessment. They want us to detail what would have been the normal procedure if there would not have been an in silico model that we use. So what would be the normal strategy? So how big is the impact of the in silico on the regulatory dossier? So those two things combined are the heart of the credibility exercise. Then this leads to specific goals for your credibility, translating into specific activities that you then can execute. And ultimately, you have to assess, do the UQ, the uncertainty quantification, and to see where you land with respect to the context of use that you identified. And then you can have a model-informed decision. So this was translated into a number of publications where we have the three parties, the academia, industry, and regulators in the author list. Even HTAs are participating here. And it is really important because now we have something that we can refer to, that people, sponsors, when they go to EMA, that they can refer to. So this really helps to streamline the communication and the expectations and the vocabulary between sponsors and regulators. They realized that this was actually not such a bad thing to have academia involved. And so the publication of these papers led to the next question, like, okay, now we have this thing out. We actually have questions on how to interact between drugs and devices and how to regulate that. So this was the kickoff of a first triple helix expertise exchange meeting, and it will be the first in a series where we again bring these same stakeholders together to talk about specific topics in public workshops, to keep that dialogue going. So this whole thing kicked something in motion, and it's really good because now the questions come from all the sides, and there's a much more freer flow of information. The notified bodies in Europe, so the ones that regulate or that assess the devices, they're lagging a bit behind, but they went through this whole restructuring with the medical device regulation. So they're now starting to catch up. The second part that I wanted to talk about is a tissue characterization community challenge. Now, when you are taking your model to the regulator, and it is something that contains some mechanical or some material properties of the tissues that you're working on, for instance, mechanical properties, they need to come from somewhere. You need to have some source and the correct meta information for that data set in order for the regulator to really accept that information. Now, the literature, if you're talking about mechanical characterization, is filled with papers doing all kinds of mechanical testing on all kinds of tissues, but there's a lot of variability in the results. So if we want to have a common database, we can't just collate all that information. We need to somehow start from scratch and come up with a community consensus or a way to at least document the correct meta information so that this information can be used in a regulatory filing. And this is something that we wanted to do in a PPP constellation, so a public-private partnership. And as a proof of concept to be able to go and ask for money for this public-private partnership, we did a community challenge. And we said, okay, we'll show how we are going to do this. And what we will do is we'll bring together the community and we'll run one such challenge. For instance, we will focus on mechanical properties and we will measure in a uniaxial tensile test the properties of aortic tissues. And we will do that in a way that when we have our consensus protocol, that this is adhering to the relevant standards that we have consulted with ASME, with DIN, and with other standardization bodies. What you see here is a flow of a typical, from a tissue collection to the measurement of different properties and the use in silico modeling. There are many different steps that will have an effect on the actual values that you come up with in your measurement. We decided to really focus just on one single aspect of that in our first test campaign. And the test campaign is composed out of 4 steps. So first, we collect expressions of interest. And then we send all those people, all those different labs across the world, we send them a tissue sample and a synthetic sample to do the measurement with their in-house protocol. We collect that information, we put them together, and we analyze that in a statistical manner to see what the variation is. Is there a trend in the variation? Can this be attributed to specific choices that have been made? That analysis. And that has actually now taken place. And the results are, well, they show that there is an urgent need of coming to a consensus protocol, let's say, because it's very hard to find the cause of this huge deviation that we sometimes see. Now we're establishing at the moment for this uniaxial tensile test consensus protocol. The next meeting is next week, after which everybody will be sent another sample of the same tissue and the synthetic tissue to do the measurement now with the consensus protocol, hoping that at least the variability between the different measurements will have been reduced. And this is then what will be made public. This is what I mentioned, the uniaxial tensile testing of the porcine aorta is the first application. Although we know that uniaxial tensile testing is not very ideal for aortic tissues, but it was a simple one to start with. As you can see, we have participants from all across the globe, which is sometimes a logistical challenge to get the tissue samples there on the dry ice, but we managed to do that this time. And if you want to have more information, you can always sign up for the next test campaign. You can find that on the website c4bio.eu. So this is on the technical side. About the interaction with other stakeholders. For the clinical community, well, different stakeholders should be approached in different ways. And whereas for academics, you can do that by engaging them in specific activities. For clinicians, yeah, it's a bit more tricky, and everybody has their own clinicians with who you work, but it's always very hard to then spread, evangelizing Silico from there onwards. So we wanted to start here with a survey where we, in 25 questions, ask clinicians what they know about in silico, what terms they know, what concepts they know, how they feel about using in silico, whether they already have people in their team doing that, and what are their doubts and hesitations for the adoption of in silico medicine. So this survey recently was wrapped up, and we're now analyzing the results that then also will be shared, of course, with the community. So these are the main things. So assessing the level of confidence, and then being able to identify what should be the points to first work on. Then again, back on the technical side, I should have ordered them a bit differently. On the technical side, we have noticed, and it seems to be very relevant for this community as well, that at some point, the European Commission started to call everything AI. Everything that was digital was AI, and they had no clue. We realized that it wasn't because they knew what AI was, they just didn't know the difference between AI and other digital technologies. So we put our heads together and we created a white paper specifically aimed at members of the commission, policymakers, to try and explain to them that in silico basically is a spectrum, that you have white box on the one end, black box on the other end, but that most of our applications actually use either multiple technologies or things that are somewhere in the middle. And the message that we are trying to push there as well is that when you want people to tackle a problem, you shouldn't also impose a technology. It is the problem that will determine what kind of technology should be used. It is the problem that determines what kind of data is available, and it is the kind of information that you have at your availability that will then determine also what technologies can be used. If you can't have sufficient data to do AI, and in healthcare, it is still a challenge to have sufficiently good data. And you can do data collection, but in certain cases, like in rare diseases or in cases like regenerative medicine, medical clinical studies, the numbers will not be there ever to be able to do AI in a very decent way. So you need to add the mechanistic component that in many cases you at least know some things of. So this is a narrative that we try to push, and we saw that it was, after a while it started to catch on. So now when the commission publishes things, they talk about AI and other digital technologies such as computer modeling and simulation. So somehow we've gotten through to them that there is more to the in silico spectrum than AI. So it can actually make a difference. So this is what I said, it should be AI and mechanistic, or it should be the in silico spectrum rather than one or the other. And yeah, this is what I said. So they are now actually taking up this this terminology, and we see that it's still a bit confusing for them because they're using in silico medicine, digital twins, computer modeling, VPHi technologies, all intertwined. But it's a step forward in the right direction for us. And then the last thing that I wanted to talk about is something called the good simulation practice. The good simulation practice is a grassroots initiative from the community, mostly European and US, but it's also contributions from other places in the world, where we want to come to something like the good laboratory practice, the good clinical practice, have such a guidance that will allow people, to have one go-to standard, that if you follow this, that that you will facilitate your regulatory acceptance, your regulatory trajectory. And in order for such a GSP to build up, we're working with the Alliance to come up with a proposal. This is not something that we can do as a community, but we want organizations that can implement such a good practice to have something to start with. So what we're doing is we're collecting all kinds of elements of this GSP, and we do this in a Slack community called In Silico World, where we have identified, first of all the different contexts of use for in silico medicine, and now we're going to detail, information for the modeler, information for what are regulatory guidances, the standards that are available. So all this information will be in the GSP document that then will lead you to appropriate standards that you have. So if you follow the GSP, that should become like a standard to have a good, like a quality stamp for your in silico model. So these are some of the examples that we're currently working on. Of course, there are many more. There are other stakeholders that we need to work on. There are other activities that we are developing with patients, training for people in companies that are sitting in regulatory that typically deal with normal dossiers with in vitro and in vivo data that now need to include in silico. So there's a whole lot of different people and different activities that we are engaging in. And this, of course, can only be done when enough people come together and find a niche, find something that they're interested in, and find something that they can get back from this. So my final slide would be this one, that if you want to translate your in silico methods from the screen to the patient, that this really is a community effort next to your technical work, that this is a community effort. And if we come together as a community, that we can actually, as I showed, we can actually make a difference and influence the policies such that they support us as well. With that, I would like to conclude and thank you for your information, for your attention.
Thank you very much. It's very impressive, and I think there'll be a lot of conversation about it. I think these are issues that are critical, and I do very much appreciate the presentation.
Thank you.
So now we'll move on to our second speaker, which is Rufus Pollock. And again, I won't do an elaborate invitation. I will just turn over the screen to you and ask you to, actually, I'm not sharing it, am I? Sorry. I could have, I was turning the screen over to you before I meant to. Next will be Rufus Pollock, who's going to be talking to us about data portals and data management for accelerating time to insight.
Great. Hi, everybody. So, go back. There we go. Great. Thank you for the opportunity. I hope everyone can hear me okay. Welcome. So maybe I could start very briefly, say a little bit about me, as I know that. So I've been involved in. So I was also, I should maybe say in this one, I was an academic researcher at one point. I was an economist at the University of Cambridge. Yeah, and so I was an academic there. I did a fair amount of research. Also, we did some other stuff in the natural science at that point. And then I've been for about 20 years in parallel with some of that. I did a lot of work around, I guess, open data, information sharing in the sciences, about open science, and then open data in government, and open information, open knowledge in general. And I founded a nonprofit called the Open Knowledge Foundation in 2004 that's still very active internationally. I stepped down as the CEO of that in 2014, 2015. And out of open knowledge came actually a company which is now called Datopian, which builds data platforms or works with people around a piece of open source software that I'll talk about later called CCAN. And OKF pioneered open data internationally, particularly in government, but also we did a lot of work in research and science. And as I said, Datopian spun out. It's been building data platforms for governments and IGOs and others for longer than anyone else. Pretty much at this point. And I helped build the first government data portals like Data.gov UK or Data.gov, but also research platforms and portals. And I've helped build dozens of those over the last decade. I've also written a book called The Open Revolution, which you can download for free if you want at openrevolution.net, which is about how we make a radically fairer and freer information age. And I've also advised on data and data strategy to many organizations, governments, research councils, IGOs, startups, etc. So I want to talk a bit today, really the context, and this may, I have some context about the audience here, so we'll go into the questions. I hope I'm not covering too much old kind of ground. So I kind of just want to start what's, in general, and will be familiar in your area. I mean, I did a lot of work. I was very kind of very interested in. I ended up with someone on our board at OKF, and I talked to a lot who worked at the Sanger Center on the original Human Genome Project. I mean, essentially, whether it's in research, whether it's in government, whether it's in enterprise, originally we corrected data for a use. You essentially had normally it was use driven, and your data was one-to-one with use in whatever you were doing. So you'd collect a particular data set, whether it's, you're collecting GDP numbers for some reason to inform your Secretary of the Treasury's decision-making or whatever, you essentially, or it was, you're doing a research project and you go and collect a data set and then you use it and you write your publication and you publish it and so on. And that was the kind of old world. So, and in that one, you kind of have acquisition and you have use. And there isn't much more than that going on, really. And then what's happened is uses and sources start multiplying. So essentially, as a researcher, I mean, I could think of myself as an economist, you could think of some other area. You go from this, even in your own lab, you might collect obviously multiple sources, but suddenly you're using sources from outside your lab or from elsewhere, or you've got your data set, but you're combining it, even in trivial ways with other data. I mean, the example I always use is that I happen to publish a data, kind of open data, and one data set just hugely used as a list of countries with their country codes. So suddenly, just for whatever reason, you've got this data set and you've got country codes and you want countries to label your graph, just in such a trivial way, but there's this sudden massive reuse and sharing of data going on. There's a lot more data out there. There's a lot of data that you're combining with. So, and the set of use cases, I want to emphasize this, is also exploding. So what's also happening is you may collect data for a particular use, but suddenly someone can use it for some other use that was unexpected. You might be doing your research project, you've collected this data set, you've done your publication or whatever, but wow, actually this data set could be used for something else entirely that you didn't even think of. And again, to make it a concrete example, I was very involved at one point in government. I did a lot of work also around government transparency. A concrete example was persuading the UK government to release spending data and kind of budget data. And obviously, government had collected budget information internally to run its budgeting in its departments, and individual departments collected spending data, i.e., what they actually bought and spent money on. Obviously they collected that, but they didn't tend to share it. In fact, they didn't even tend to share spending data with the Department of the Treasury. They would share reports like, we had budget X and we spent Y against budget X. So when this data got kind of released, suddenly some people, and even inside of government, could do things like, say, one guy in government was like, oh, I reckon we're spending a lot of money on buying expensive technology reports from Gartner. Now, in the old days, that would have been, he'd had to send a memo around, asked all the other departments, how much do you spend on these Gartner reports? And 6 months later, he might have had an answer. Now, because that data was available, even though it was collected basically just to do, financial management within a department, suddenly the chief technology officer of the UK government could actually go and answer this question about where money was being spent on technology insights, work out that often different departments were buying the same report, and could save £5 million in about 15 minutes of research. So it's an example of a really unexpected, and obviously I also came from academia. This was starts to happen frequently. There's regular cases where you're like, oh, can I get data from these guys? We could reanalyze it or combine it with this. So just to explain, it's increasingly difficult though. As this happens, it becomes increasingly difficult to discover and access data, especially if you're a kind of new user in this space. So there's this users and sources are multiplying. There's then this need to organize and present data for discovery and use. Before that wasn't the case. You collected data and you used it, and there's no need to organize it that much. And there's a need for data management, and especially you'd start to say what are called data portals, like some kind of platform where you can access or discover data. And this often happens to start with within a community even. You know, there might be, you know, there starts to be a small community, everyone's publishing different data sets. Well, you know, where are they? What state are they in, etc. And it also means that new users in the space suddenly find it's like, oh, I know where I can find data. And to make a comment, these portals or platforms started first in government about 10 or 15 years ago, about 10, 11, 12 years ago, mainly because I think government had certain characteristics, which were that they had a lot of data that could be used by others. They were in a position to release it, but it was also quite distributed. It wasn't very centralized, as this made sense. And obviously, you know, there tend to be some degree of, you know, obviously now, you know, universities have like, you know, you're supposed to put your publication somewhere and so on, but often the data portal is a bit specific. So what I want to emphasize, compared to this diagram we had here of acquisition and use, we end up with this new thing that we're kind of doing around data and the data kind of chain, which is management. There's some job to often organize and present data, and you often create a data portal. And obviously you've seen that, I think, research. I mean, take the Genome project and many others. There are these efforts, you know, obviously this is not novel, going back decades actually, prior to the modern data portal kind of effort, where people would create centralized data sets like protein data banks or the genome data bank. So this kind of centralization, organization of data has gone on. But the fact there's ubiquity of it, this normality of it, the fact that very rapidly, even in small sectors, creating a kind of data portal or platform is useful is, I think, a bit more recent, that it just becomes common. So to summarize, old world, you kind of acquisition for use, it's kind of one-to-one, it's kind of very simple. The new world, you kind of introduce data management, and I'd say data portals or data platforms as a part of the data use or data value chain. Yeah, and as I said, you know, to recap, value created when the data is used, when we match data to use. So I sometimes just think this analogy of the internet as well, of like the data explosion. If you think of the early days of the web, you didn't have search engines. You just had people who put pages up, and other people knew where to find them. And in fact, the first kind of search engine was Yahoo, which was just a curated set of links. They literally would just have, you want all the links for, like, I don't know, people writing about X, here's a page with them. And as the internet, the web grew, that kind of stopped working. You had kind of organized kind of content management in the middle, if you like, or search, you know, which was search engines, ways to organize discovery and kind of access to the data to some extent. So there's kind of this crude analogy in that way. So before it was simple, now use and supply have proliferated, particularly data is reused outside of its original purpose. There's many combination of multiple data sources and multiple uses, multiple sources. It's a challenge to use and discover data. So that requires the need for data management to organize and present data to make it findable and usable. And this explains the rise of data portals and platforms. So in short, data explosion creates need for data management, and a key data management tool is a data portal platform. So I want to just briefly then segue, say, well, what tooling, and this is my background particularly, if I talk a little bit about this one, is then what tooling, and I'm going to talk about one, but it's quite easy that there are multiple ways you can build data platforms. And that's something, you know, I could give another whole talk about. I've been doing now for over a decade, 10 or 15 years. But I want to talk briefly about CCAN, which is an open source platform for doing that. Which is a platform I and Datopian built. Actually, first version of it was 2007. It's the world's leading open source data management platform, probably the world's leading data management platform. It's usable both out of the box and as a platform or kind of a framework that you can use to build custom solutions. It's used, it makes it easy to publish, share, and work with data metadata. And it's been used a lot. It has been used a lot in research. It's particularly been used for open data portals by governments, but also in enterprise. very large Fortune 500 pharmaceutical company, for example, uses it, and so on and so forth. The NHS are using it to publish large amounts of data. It's being used to publish COVID data by the NHS in Scotland, just build their own. And yeah, it's for government, for enterprise, and for research. Yeah, I would also emphasize that often data management sort of kind of can evolve from like, or just be a portal, like a gateway to data sets that are out there, or a catalog. It's like, here you can find a list of all the data sets, doesn't necessarily hold any of those data sets, to something more that becomes like a data lake almost, or a kind of more fully fledged data platform, where the system is actually holding some of that data, or at least allowing you to inspect data or look at it. You can obviously involve permissions. I emphasize that can be very important in obviously research context, that data, some data may be accessible to everyone, some data may be restricted, it has, you know, personally identified information, or it's other reasons that it's restricted. And CCAN has a lot of support for that kind of things, for permissioning, for versioning, for visualization, for custom metadata management, all kinds of things like that that come up in this area. And it's also kind of componentized. You can use the bits of it that you want, and kind of not use the bits you don't want. So I think also to emphasize, this may not be so relevant, but it's fully open source. You can kind of deploy it yourself, so you can, but it's also it is also one that's professionally supported. So it's one where there's kind of, you know, you have, you know, it's not, you're on your own. The batteries are included, and there's multiple people who provide professional services about it. And yeah, there's multiple examples of it I can go through. It's powering kind of variety of portals. Well, this is a bit oriented to government. This presentation is a bit oriented to government portals. But yeah, I can, and I think, yeah, this idea of the data exchange, often you could think of this now as that these are like these data, not marketplaces that there's any price or paid, but like a place where you can discover data within a community. For example, the humanitarian data exchange was built by the UN, because what they saw was, at least in the humanitarian, and I think this is an analogy often sometimes for some research areas, this was built by UN OCHA, who deal with humanitarian response in humanitarian crises. What they were seeing was that there wasn't really a very easy central place, kind of clearinghouse for these data sets. So people in a crisis, even some of those base data sets, like, you know, we need basic geodata on Afghanistan, or we want to know basic kind of, you know, we want to have the, you know, population data, because we need to, in a crisis, we need to know that, like granular population data to combine with our other information on like where the earthquake happened. And often in a given crisis, that stuff was just, you know, it was all over the place, and people were kind of pulling it from different places. There wasn't a reliable source. They kind of act as a kind of clearinghouse for data sets, in which many different stakeholders publish data into that platform, including from the community, including from the UN itself. So it acts as that kind of clearing space. And it kind of provides, you know, a central place to look, but also increasing reliability and kind of save effort. People are not having to collect or organize the same data again and again. Yeah, and I won't, there's quite a lot of, I can go through some of the feature stuff, but I'm going to do that. I think I'm coming towards my time here, so I'd like to end relatively promptly on that one. So maybe just to kind of come back and just finish in here, having mentioned about the platform, in general, what we see in the world today in many areas is, when I say you, it might be a given community, it might even be your lab, or it might be others, have a lot of data. And this is often, you know, it's a great asset, it's a great opportunity, but it often does also tend to be underutilized and somewhat poorly managed for a variety of reasons. So, and from my experience, working with governments, IGOs, enterprise, just having the data is not enough. If the data is fragmented, it doesn't really generate the value it could. And to unlock that value, really, you need to manage, organize, and present that data effectively. And the key first step in doing that, and there are other things, like another big thing is data quality and, you know, some degree of process, but a first point is a unified discovery point. And it reduces fragmentation, it increases discovery, and it generates scale. So that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That was both of you got through an enormous amount of material in recordly short time. So I could open up the floor for questions. I guess before I open up the floor to questions, we'll have a few minutes for general questions anyway. We have an option of continuing the discussion in 2 breakout rooms with you separated or keeping you together. And I usually leave it up to the speakers as to whether they'd like to have a roundtable pit for everybody or whether you'd like to have the opportunity to talk a little bit more individually with people.
To me, it's the same. I don't have a specific preference.
Rufus?
Yeah, I don't have a preference. And I guess my feeling is if there might be people who are interested in both, it's very difficult to tell at this moment. I know they were quite different topics, but I was fascinated by the first presentation as well. So it's always great to, but yeah, so at the moment, it'd be more up to the audience. If some people wanted to voice, like they've got lots of questions on a particular, but I have to say, I would follow your lead.
Well, it's interesting. You said they're very different. From where I sit, the 2 talks had an enormous overlap. But
yeah.
Okay, so I'll open it up. We have a few general questions before we do our round to our no holds barred. Any specific questions for our speakers? William, why don't we start with you? Oh, sorry, William, why don't we start with you?
Sure. Hello. So if I have a project for some sort of an ambitious in silico model of a human, or a or a digital twin of an immune system, right? I'm going to have to feed these models with quite a lot of data. Some of it is going to be sort of standard background data about the characteristics of different cells or tissues or these sorts of things. Some of it might be a little bit more like telemetry, data collected in real time of sort of what's going on. And I probably want these to be accessed in kind of an automated way, right? I mean, I probably don't want to, as my simulation is running, I probably don't want to go and look at a web page and see, see what data sets are available, that sort of thing, right? So maybe we want some automated programmatic glue between the simulations and the data, and so I guess it's partly a question for both of the speakers about how how that fits kind of in the middle, and yeah, it's just sorry, it wasn't very well formed as a question, but it was just kind of partly an observation. And could you elaborate on that if that makes any sense?
Would you like me? Is that for Liesbet? I think that question.
It's kind of for both. It's kind of for both of you.
Okay, great.
Yeah, it's a bit tricky, and also specific. I'm not the expert on accessing data, so what you want is to build a structure that will allow your model, which is partly already parameterized based on historic data, mechanistic data, that can automatically then access telemetric data. Did I reformulate it, or do you see it even broader than that?
Well, maybe a little bit. I mean, it might be broader than that, but I suppose, do we need such a thing? Right. So is the Virtual Physiological Human Institute, for example, could you see yourself running a data portal which is perhaps runs software like CCAN that just keeps track of all of the data, that all of the models and submodels and things that are needed for this kind of project?
So this would be the super encompassing form of the database that I mentioned in the community consensus
Yes.
challenge, where yeah, well, VPHi will never run something like that because we're really just a scientific society with academics doing this, you know, in their spare time, of which we don't have many. But maybe there should be some form of public-private initiative where this can work. I mean, if something like if this concept of when we collect data, we collect the necessary background information in a certain way that there is some kind of community consensus, well, yeah, then it's easier to collect that as well. There are already in toxicology, for instance, there's also huge endeavors ongoing to mine that data, but also to transform or to come up with apps that allow to easily get your data in the right format. So whether we will ever end up with one monstrous database, I don't really think so, but it's useful, I think, especially data that has been used in a validated model, to somehow make that available. That should be possible, but I don't have the practical details for that. That's maybe where Rufus can come in.
So Will, just so I understand, maybe you reiterate, as you're saying, maybe we even understand the area, that people basically run models, because I'm also not as familiar as maybe this audience, that people are running models and there's input data that's being used either to create the models or to then parameterize the models when you run them. Is that what we're saying? Yeah.
Yes.
And I mean, you know, like, I don't know what it's like in most areas still, but my experience is that things are kind of like that. So one thing I'll say, I think, in terms of Liesbet, I think always, like, we're not trying to ever build some, like, the whole point even, I think, of data platforms or data portals like the ones that I've been building is partly the real world is quite distributed. You're not ever, one of the things you're trying to, I wouldn't say avoid, but trying to build like a centralized database of data is like always it's often very difficult. The advantage of data portals, data catalogs at the beginning is you're trying to just like make something simple where people can start registering data sets or registering these connections in a, you know, maybe at the beginning, a kind of ad hoc manner. Like to give an example of data portals at the beginning, you know, you didn't have all government departments registering all of their data. It started kind of like incrementally. Some departments would put up their data, and there's kind of like a, you know, so just to say, that's one thing to really emphasize. The attraction of a data portal or platform is that kind of it's kind of a place where people can start putting stuff or just registering the existence of data sets, often at a very low, you know, you want to keep it at very low transaction costs. You know, in my experience, both as a researcher and working with everyone's really busy, right? Everyone's super, and, you know, and even data reuse is sort of a public good. You know, it's like, why, you know, unfortunately, as yet, like often data production, so there's some special cases, but often data sharing production isn't super, you know, you don't get lots of citations for it compared to the paper. That's changing a bit. But I just say, so you're really trying to make something low. I do think registering what Will's saying, though, in terms of the reproducible science, other stuff, is a major win. If that can be done in cheap ways, you know, like you can definitely enhance a portal platform where you have you're registering and representing data sets, and you could be registering and representing models and quickly creating it. Like, this model used these data sets, you know, or something like that. I think the other thing, you know, which that also facilitates, is understanding which data sets are really like being reused a lot. You know, maybe that's obvious, but I think that's also quite useful. I kind of want to emphasize that my experience in all of this, and even in building, you know, the product, is, you know, that making things as simple and low transaction cost kind of for the participants is valuable. And at the same time, I think the other thing to really emphasize is that this kind of tooling is also starting to become useful, I would say, even for individual teams. Like, the story, and I don't know for others, is when I was, and this is now a decade ago, when I was at Cambridge, I was living with someone who was working in the Brain Imaging Institute at Cambridge, and then was doing work on autism and dyslexia. And, you know, I was always like, their version management for data was copying an Excel file pretty much every day and making a copy of it. Like, that was their data versioning process. And it led to a lot of, I mean, you know, they would have issues like something had been misentered, and then like they'd go back, and, you know, like a lot of people, you know, and I did a lot of data cleaning up in economics. It's like, you know, this is a painful, you have your grad students doing it or whatever, but it's not and things like the data portal can start helping people with even things like that. Like, it's a reliable place. It can do data versioning for you automatically. Like, you upload a new copy, it stores the old one. That's the other sales point, I would just say, like, in terms of adoption in a given community, that this can do those kind of things. That's, directly useful in people's like day-to-day research work. I think we've all had experiences of like, damn it, 2 years ago, we had that data set that was useful, and I can't locate it right now. Like, it would be useful now because I want to either go back to that paper or I want to combine it with something new and I can't find it. That's not an unknown experience in academia, even in your own research lab or whatever. And so those are things that like the data portal starts kind of assisting with, of like, oh yeah, I can go back, I can find things, and so on. So I think that, and I just emphasize this practically because of, in terms of adoption or anything like that, that's, those points are really important.
This is John. I have a question for each. One for Lies. How do we connect our communities better? Are there some things that we could be doing right now to increase the opportunities for communication between people on the west side of the ocean and you guys that have such incredibly common interests? And we can comment on that, and I'll ask my question of Rufus afterwards. I'd really like to hear a little bit about what metadata is in your mind, and if you were to take a couple medical kinds of, like heart monitor, I got heart data. What's the metadata that you envision would be basic, essential, that, it's not for any particular purpose, but the goal ultimately is the traceability of data? And so, what are the things that you would consider minimally required to be recorded with my heart rate? And then, does the metadata accumulate things like who else has already used this data for what, which is something you were kind of alluding to in your discussion. So there are my two questions, and Lies, if you'd go first.
Sure, thanks, John. It is true that VPHi originally started as more European focused. Also, a lot of our funding interactions with funding bodies are focused on the European side, although we've always had a very strong interaction with Auckland, with New Zealand. On the industry side, however, the US is actually very strongly present. Medtronic and ANSYS and a number of other bigger companies. They J&J and Stryker, and so they do actively engage. So on the regulatory side, there is a much better distribution, I would say, of at least around the ocean. So yeah, of course, we're not the only organization that focuses on in silico medicine. So that means that as long as people find their own community and they have their own meetings, it's fine. I think if we on top of that, we can build some links that we can share some initiatives, like we have a memorandum of understanding with FDA, but we could have a memorandum of understanding with another organization as well, that we at least exchange interesting things, that we exchange the main topics that we're working on. And if there is something where a support from both sides, or there's an specific interest from both sides, then that could be a very obvious first step.
So, some simple things like agreeing that we're going to go ahead and we're going to share the announcements of our meetings on Thursdays with you to distribute as you see appropriate to the people in Europe who might be interested in what we're doing, and that somehow we formally get announcements of your webinars and meetings and things that we're able to redistribute on our mailing list, because the more people that attend, the better. And if you want to attend, you have to know what's happening. And so that should not be too difficult.
No, that should be really easy to implement.
Okay, thank you. I guess you got it, Rufus.
Yeah. There's two answers. I mean, so yeah, in general, you kind of gave the example of, the first was a general question of what's the minimal metadata that one would have, and then the second one was like, you were mentioning a specific example, the heart rate. I mean, in general, again, I think of data often sort of as a bit an analogy with code. I mean, it's a little different, but I would say like the minimal metadata is very, very little. It's like, I would say it's better to have some data, the data stored or published in a portal, or just stored somewhere published, than not at all. And the basic is the title and a description, a README, and even if that's a minimal one, is a great start. Because often people kind of go to town a bit on the metadata. Often metadata standards or like requirements get written by sort of the librarians rather than the users. I would keep things, or you need a title, a license, and a README. If I really would go minimal, the biggest thing that I often think is missing from data sets, if I say for reuse, is just a description of the columns. Like, if you're publishing a tabular data file, at least, the thing that's really valuable, 2 years later is, what, particularly if the columns are not obviously self-describing, what does this column mean? What notes do I have to make? When we collected the heart rate, we had an error. We think one of the machines wasn't functioning very well, and maybe whenever we have machine number 5, that data might not be so reliable. That's fantastically useful information when you're reusing the data. In general, obviously, you can get a lot more specific. If you've got a load of time, if I was an economist, I've got time series data, I might want to record the period this data covered. That might be a useful thing I want to search for. But in general, I would say it's the kind of, at a general level, it's the basics, and then it's the column information on the fields. I mean, I say columns, but the fields in the data set. It's a really great start. And really useful for people looking at the data and then searching for it.
So the metadata that you have in mind is that which allows me to know how to read a data set when I get it. And so are things like, we're now going to go to requiring medical device serial numbers. Every medical device will have a number. And I think things like, okay, so when that machine comes on, takes my blood pressure in the hospital and sends it to my electronic health record, the serial number of the machine that took it should be there.
Sure.
And then, like you said, an AI system would recognize a single machine that's been spitting out weird extra high and is out of calibration. Or then silly things, maybe like, there's no reason in the world that every report can't contain the geographic location, latitude and longitude of the device. Any device can know that. Well, what do you use that for? Well, if I'm trying to do research with the data and I want to collect data that represents some region, I put in the latitude and longitude boundaries of the data I want. And the system can find it.
Sure.
So, I kind of struggle with this idea of how much imagination we put into easily acquired, automatically recorded data about the data, and whether that makes sense to you.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's particularly things which are automatically added, it's not a problem. Yeah, I think also the ultimate answer would be the community of practice in that area can often decide what metadata is wanted. The one thing to emphasize is most of these systems, certainly CCAN, you can have any metadata you want on the data set, and obviously, and so on. Back to you then, questions, yeah.
Other questions? John is exceedingly passionate about these things, so I want to make sure that others also have the opportunity to ask some questions. Other questions in the room? I tend to also ask too many questions, but I see people in the room. We have Catherine Morris joining us, so that's a big honor. Thank you. Any others? I appreciate. I'm going to follow up with two short questions. Well, first for Rufus, there are sort of two parts to this. One, and I think you addressed it, is that before portals, you had the concept of repositories.
Yes.
And the issue for me with repositories was they actually hid data, because while the data set was identified, the elements of the data set were hidden, typically. And so I had this fantasy, which never happened, which Google would be the repository, so that if everything were identifiable and searchable through Google, you didn't need to have any kind of centralization, because you did a Google search and you pulled up the data, elements that you needed. And so it's interesting to me to think about what what you mean by when you talk about a portal, and what the identifiability of the data elements inside of that portal is.
So you mean, I
suppose that depends on how it's set up.
Yeah, you mean like, well, so normally the kind of, obviously the crude conceptual model, there's a data set and there are files within a data set, or tables, or, there's a data set is a collection, and then and then you have the resources, as they're called, and then you have the fields or the cells within that resource. Generally within like at least data portals by default, the data set and the resource are addressable and have like URLs and things like that. And then not all, you can have setups where the individual, then it's becoming almost like the data, you've stored the structured data in those data sets. You could address the underlying. You're quite right that in a world in which the thing is, normally it's a bit specialist to publish a data set in the way that, it's still a bit specialist to publish a web page maybe on your own, but it's like software. Why do we have software code repositories? And the thing I would emphasize often about repositories in particularly the research area is, unlike software repositories, I think of often, there's been a bit of like a critique I might make is that often, whereas a software repository is very clearly often, it's not a graveyard. it's actively part of your working process in a useful way. You want to store, you get a code repository, you can store it in, you're going to pull data out in day-to-day in your collaboration. Often like research kind of repositories, quote unquote, have often been like, they're a place you might somehow mandated to store stuff. They're not part of your day-to-day flow. And my dream of it, I call them data portals. I often hope of what I start to call data management systems, like a DMS, like you have a CMS, is they're part of your day-to-day workflow in some way. Yes, they are also a way to discover data and so on, but they become part of like, oh, my team, we need somewhere, rather than the Z drive with our 100 copies of Excel, or rather than some other ad hoc Dropbox or whatever, we have a system that's actually built for kind of data management that's serving us, and then happens to be like we use like GitHub or GitLab or something for code collaboration if you do write code, but it's also, you can also turn it into, well, this is how I click a button, I make it public, and now I publish my code to the world. But I think that's the way that data portals and repositories should go, is that they're more that rather than a kind of repository is where kind of content goes to die. You kind of feel often, right. Versus it's part of your, and that I hope that's not what data platforms are. They're an active part of your collaboration, what is increasingly a data-driven, everywhere data-driven research process.
And I could through your platform, make the individual elements in my database discoverable, so that I could ask the question, not only is there a data set on COVID infection, but I could ask the question to Google, what was the rate of infection in the US on day X?
Yes, I mean that's the dream, and obviously we've had things like Wolfram Alpha, and to some time you can now do, like in Google, you can say GDP of South Africa in 2001. I think the dream of that ladder is, I think, possible. You know, I think it's why it's often complicated in data is the amount of it's like code, like, you know, find me the line in software library X that does Y. Why it turns out to be hard is just because there's not as much contextual information as there is in content, you know, in a newspaper article that allows Google to find the page you're looking for. But it's an idea, and obviously it is successful in certain areas with, you know, what is the GDP of South Africa? What is the COVID infection rate in, you know, so it is the direction one can travel in, yes. And at least, you know, there are ways, you know, certainly you could have a system like, I want to search for a column in a data set which has, you know, I want COVID infection rate, you know, Scotland, and it will find, okay, there's a data set with the column, you know, COVID infection rate, blah, blah, blah. I mean, what I'm just trying to say is often tough is things like in the actual data set, it will just be called like, you know, CIR, COVID infect, you know, like very, very common. Many data sets have abbreviations or other stuff, which makes that harder than it should be. But it's possible.
So it's an annotation issue, basically.
It's an annotation.
Yeah.
And I would say, like with code, I would say data is a bit more like code, which is often in code, as long as I can find quickly the library, the bit of human inspection beyond that, of like, I found the code library I want, I'll now go and actually browse the source code quickly, isn't the biggest, like, if you can cut down that time to find the data set you probably want, the inspection to find the actual cell. And then if you have good data dictionary metadata that I described earlier, like column information, the other thing you can start having is very quick automation of, like, I pull the data out of the data platform into my R, or into my spreadsheet. That process is extremely quick. Just like in code, there's a lot of effort to automate, like I can get code onto my system, I can kind of, you know, install it very quickly and other things like that. I think that area is a big, you know, the loop of basically get data, work with it, redeploy it or reshare it. That loop we want to be very quick, and is something that's still quite slow. It's not as fast as it in code.
That was what I was getting at earlier with automation.
I've always had this fantasy again of annotated data sets as executable models, and
yes,
computer code and executable models annotated so that they are in fact discoverable data. And that goes to Liesbet's work very much, because we're very far from that in the kind of modeling most of us do, where the structures are hidden and things aren't annotated. It's a lot of work. In fact, there are no tools for doing that kind of annotation.
So
we're very limited.
So this is Catherine Moore. So I apologize. I came in late, so I missed Liesbet's presentation, but I want to, so I probably missed something important to this conversation. But to something that Rufus just said, so for those of you who don't know, I work in defense simulation, and there have been several attempts over the decades to support, at least for simulations as opposed to data sets, discovery and reuse. And we've struggled with the metadata problem. And there is a real tension between I think the aspiration which Rufus has described, which is that the barrier to the use of these, we'll just say data, I mean simulations, but some of the problems are the same. The tension between the making it simple for the producer to work that into their data flow, so there's not a barrier to their sharing that data, and this need by the user to have enough detail that they can rapidly decide whether or not what's in the portal, repository, whatever, is of use to them. And so we have, I don't think we've cracked the code, but we're working towards an idea that you need to constrain your metadata enough that that the reuser, the consumer of that data, can make that first order decision on, is it worth my time to dig into this some more. And so Rufus was touching on this a little bit, which is, okay, I just need to find a library that seems like it does what I need, and then it's worth my time to do the second level pass, the human pass, to read in detail. And there really is a lot of tension between those requirements, because what we discovered in the DoD was our first pass at this metadata left a lot of free text fields and a lot of optional metadata. And the result of that was that people put in like basically marketing pitches. And you're like, well, okay, that's nice that you think you have a world-class simulation that, you know, represents ground combat. And it's like, okay, but, you know, do you represent this particular platform, or do you use, kind of relating to what you're saying with, you know, tagging data with the equipment that was used to collect it? You know, do you, what simulation interoperability solution did you use? Because those are all really big questions that I, as a reuser, would need to answer in order to figure out if this is helpful to me, and your little marketing pitch is not helpful. So I guess that wasn't a very hopeful message, except that there's that tension there that is going to require some negotiation.
I think
you may have a...
Yeah, sorry, which is that search of like software library, like if I go to GitHub and search is not great. There's a lot of human, again, things that have poor, like basically data sets and software libraries, unlike web pages, don't have a lot of like web page has a lot of content that Google can use, and it can use this, and it can use the network of links to do a lot of stuff. I think if you look in other areas, like on GitHub, there's a human filtering. Like if I go and Google for like, what are the best JavaScript libraries for X? I think you can use that quite a lot in data set areas. You know, people in a given field start curating. And the other one is GitHub stars. Like you do have quite a lot of just like ranking, like so kind of really base stuff you do on data platforms. It's like, you know, okay, people can kind of, you know, without too much gaming, but there's some, if I go on GitHub and I find something with like 10,000 GitHub stars or 1,000, you know, it's probably quite, you know, it's quite reasonable. If I find one with 5, you know, probably not so actively used. So I think there's stuff like that you can do. You do want to incorporate the human element in discovery in these areas. And I don't think that's a huge problem in some of these areas. Actually, you know, it's like it hasn't stopped down. The fact there's lots of dreams in software that we would automate lots of things, and we've automated some things a lot, like testing, you know, integration, deployment, you know, there's a lot, you know, installation of complex sets of libraries. The dream I've had, which is CCAN was originally called the Comprehensive Knowledge Archive Network, was its acronym for CPAN, was what I dreamed of was a world where like when you install some software, you see like, you know, what 500 sub libraries being installed. What I would love is the day where I'm like, I want data set X, and that requires 300 other data sets, and they've all just been installed for me and it all works. You know, the manual copy and pasting from, you know, one spreadsheet to another, those days are over. You know, that would be a huge transformation of just like kind of data componentization type thing in research, in my experience, and would also reduce error a lot.
I mean, one thing that and again, I shouldn't be monopolizing the conversation, so anybody who would like to ask a question should feel free to cut me off. But one of the things that systems biology markup language does, which I liked a lot, is that at least in principle, it allows you to keep the conceptual model and the mathematical models together. And typically in computer code, the ideas, the knowledge behind the computer code is not embedded in the computer code. There is a deformable way of describing the conceptual understanding that went into the computer code. And systems biology markup language has a fairly narrow remit, but in fact, it can, if it's used properly, describe the biology, and even have embedded images of what the biology that it's describing is. And that allows you to have conceptual access to the content, to the mathematical and computational content of models, in a rather unusual way. I don't think there are very many places in biology that give that kind of combination of code, mathematics, and conceptual model.
I was going to refer to exactly the same thing as you, James, to SBML. The unfortunate thing is that maybe that's what you meant with the narrow remit, but there is not a lot of data or model types that can fit in that markup language. And there have been efforts to have the tissue level or the cell level, but some have been canceled already. So when you go outside of the more simple models, it becomes trickier to do that, because then you have infinite possibilities of combining different things. Maybe something like a GSP could go in that direction. In fact, I need to check. I don't know if in the GSP we have a chapter that goes back to kind of brief metadata, somehow inspired on the SBML, but that might be something that we could try and see if there's something that we can put in there that could serve as a first shot at identifying at least the different things that you would want to see in the metadata.
Do you have a link to this? Because I mean, it seems parallel to one of the things we did early on with open knowledge and data publishing and these sorts of things, was actually also a set of practices for what you should do if you publish data. And this sounds very, very much parallel to that, but about simulations. And it would be interesting to.
I will put it in the chat. It's a Slack community of practice, and you just have to send them an email, and then you are admitted to the Slack, and you can choose whatever conversation is ongoing in the different channels to join that. So I will post.
It's not a document. Should there be a document, a simple document that says these are the?
No, that was what is being worked on. So the different chapters have been identified, and now people have started the writing process. So you're very welcome to join to create the document.
Cool. So other questions. I had one other question, because it comes up to both things, where we talked about digital twins, and it's in the question of what data means. I always get a little nervous when I hear data used without qualifiers, because to me there are different types of data that have fundamentally different attributes. And for example, this conversation is being live streamed, and I think for Rufus, what I've heard him talk about was mainly static data sets or closed data sets. If I'm going to build a digital twin, I'm actually got to keep it in registration in real time. With the model has to be kept in registration in real time. So I have to actually be streaming, for example, telemetry information into that model. And so I wondered what you've thought about, and obviously much harder to do this. How do you annotate and how do you manage not static data that was collected in the past, but actually real-time process? How would I manage? I actually don't know how to distribute the Zoom, the YouTube link for this discussion, for example, in advance, because it's generated when I start the session. How do you manage dynamic data, live data? And that also comes to Liesbet, because if you want to build digital twins, that's a real issue.
This will be my last one, then I will need to drop it. So to
I'm
answer
sorry,
the question,
yes,
it's quite common to have a time series data. I mean, the question is, you're creating a point. I mean, there's two parts, which is how do you manage storage and how do you create identifiers and reliable access to that thing? So, for example, you know, we have data sets managed in data platforms we build. Obviously, in that case, where data is being updated every minute, for example, it's energy data from the grid where data is being. In that case, obviously, what you're really getting, you have a data set in the CCAM platform, but what it's backed by in that case is not like a CSV file that's stored somewhere. It's actually a pointer to a database. Basically, you have an API endpoint to a database that's being written to every minute. There may be snapshots that are downloaded. So what you can also do is download in bulk all the data up to yesterday, because you don't want people querying your database for 10 million rows. So there's some kind of there's some optimizations, but essentially you get and that's true. When you strictly go to a software, I think there's a lot of analogies. You go to a software project. I don't know. You go to the Firefox GitHub repository. You've got to point it to Firefox, but obviously it's being updated with new software commits every day or every week. So you've got this reference, which point, we're getting philosophical, but I think you're asking a practical question. The philosophical question is you've got to point it to something that's changing, just like, Theseus's ship, which is constantly being replaced. You still call it Theseus's ship. So you can have that. The backing is obviously you need a way to be able to access into some database that's being updated, and also to be able to update to point to it at a particular point in time, because that will be important for work. This model ran with the data as it was at this point of time. So that's the only other thing you want to be able to do is say that. So I think that's not an uncommon problem actually nowadays is streaming data. And obviously the answer is it's not backed by a file in storage, it's backed by a pointer to a database which is being incremented. And there's also protocols for that one. Thank you. I just want to say at the end, thank you everyone for your time and attention. Thank you for the invitation, William and Jane. I really appreciate it. I need to drop now as I am in Europe, actually, France.
We overran your time, so thank
you.
No,
it was a real pleasure, and I'd love if there are opportunities to follow up, or you have further questions, or are looking to build something. I'm very happy to give advice. And William is a very old colleague and friend of mine, kind of comrade in arms in the data liberation efforts. And I lost at least 12 years ago. So thank you all very much for the invitation. All the very best, and good luck to everyone. Ciao,
Thank you
ciao.
so much for joining us. Thank you.